What if the whole debate at the Council of Nicaea started with, well, the wrong questions? In this explainer, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to step back from all that 4th century Greek metaphysics and try to get inside the legal and conceptual world of the 1st century apostles. The goal? To piece together a view of the Son not as a co-equal substance, but as the Father's supreme divine agent.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to set the stage by establishing a totally different historical starting point. Then, we'll unpack the specific Jewish conceptual tools the apostles were actually using. With that foundation in place, we'll build out a different ontological model, show how it completely reframes key biblical terms, and then, and this is the fun part, we'll use it to challenge the standard Nicene formula.
Okay, Section 1, a different starting point. Now, our entire analysis really hangs on one critical methodological idea. The apostles were products of Second Temple Judaism, right? So if we really want to understand their Christology, we have to start in their conceptual world, not with the categories of Hellenistic philosophy that came centuries later.
And you know, this simple premise, it forces us to reframe the entire debate. Think about it. Instead of asking that classic Hellenistic question, what is the Son's substance, what if we ask the Jewish question, what is the Son's role? See how that works? It immediately shifts the focus from some abstract metaphysical essence to divine agency and representation. It's a whole different ballgame.
So this approach is trying to recover what the source material calls a tertium quid, basically a third way. It's not Arianism, which says the Son is a created being, and it's not Nicene Orthodoxy, which insists on co-equal substance. No, this proposes something else entirely, subordinationist derivative divinity. It's a model where the Son is fully divine, he's eternal, but his divinity is perpetually derived from the Father, who remains the one single ultimate source.
So what were these conceptual building blocks that were just lying around for the apostles to use? Well, in Section 2, we're going to examine the key ideas from their Jewish context that really form the bedrock for this alternative Christology.
First up, let's talk about the Hebrew concept of tselem, or image. Now, in the ancient Near East, when you said a king was the image of a god, you didn't mean they shared the same divine substance. Not at all. You meant the king was the god's royal representative on earth. What Genesis does is kind of democratize this idea, making all of humanity God's vice-regents. And this sets a critical precedent for us. Image is about a representative function, not an ontological essence.
Okay, next up, we have this legal principle of the shaliach, or agent. Now, under Jewish law, this was a huge deal. An appointed agent carried the full authority of the person who sent them. To deal with the agent was, for all legal purposes, to deal with the sender themselves. This creates a framework of perfect representation that is totally distinct from ontological identity.
And this quote from Matthew? It's the perfect illustration of this principle in action. When Jesus says these words, he is not making some grand metaphysical claim about his substance. He's invoking the legal logic of shaliach. The chain of agency is perfect, it's unbroken. So any honor, or any rejection, that's directed at the agent legally just flows right up the chain to the ultimate sender.
And here's the kicker. This idea of a supreme divine agent wasn't some brand new Christian innovation. Far from it. Second Temple Jewish thought was already filled with these kinds of intermediary figures. You've got Lady Wisdom from Proverbs, Philo's Logos or Second God, and even the mystical figure Metatron, the so-called lesser YHW. What these examples show is that there was already a well-established precedent for a figure who is pre-cosmically divine, incredibly powerful, yet still totally distinct from and subordinate to God the Father.
All right, so in Section 3, we're going to see how all these concepts, image, agency, mediation, all come together to create a completely new ontological map. Because instead of that simple binary we're used to, God and creature, this Jewish toolkit allows for a much more complex, layered reality.
And this slide right here maps out that reality for us. Tier 1, you have the Father, the autotheos, the uncaused source of everything. Down at Tier 3, you have all of creation, angels, humans, the whole cosmos. But the critical distinction, the game changer, is the introduction of Tier 2, the Son, the Logos. He's not a creature, but he's also not the uncaused source. He is eternally generated from the Father. This makes him ontologically superior to creation, yet ontologically derivative of his source. This middle tier, this is the conceptual space that Nicene thought just completely collapsed.
The source material offers this really powerful metaphor to explain it. Think of the Father as an eternal spring, and the Son is the eternal river that just necessarily flows from it. The spring is logically prior, right? It's the source of the river. But there was never a time that the spring existed without the river flowing. It's a relationship of eternal, necessary derivation, not co-equal identity.
Okay, so now that we're armed with this three-tier framework, we can go back in Section 4 and re-examine those key Greek Christological terms, and what you'll see is that when you view them through this lens of agency and derivation, their traditional meanings shift dramatically.
Just look at this. These key terms, which we've traditionally read through a lens of substance, they consistently point back to representation. Take morphe, or form. In Philippians, it signifies a visible role, not an inner essence. I mean, Jesus also took the form of a slave, right? Then you have icon, or image, which is inherently derivative. An image always points back to its original. And character, the exact imprint, is like the impression left by a seal in wax. It perfectly represents the seal, but it's not the seal itself. All three of these words belong to the world of agency, not ontological identity.
All right, so in our final section, we're going to take this reconstructed framework and use it to critique the standard model. Now that we have this three-tier ontology in mind, we can really re-evaluate both the Nicene formula and its most sophisticated modern defense.
The core critique here is that Nicaea committed a fundamental category error. As this slide lays out, the apostles were busy answering a Jewish question about Jesus' role in God's plan, and they were using categories of function and agency. But the Nicaean fathers answered a very different, Hellenistic question about Jesus' substance, using the categories of metaphysics. By changing the question, they inevitably ended up distorting the original apostolic answer.
And this category error, it creates these persistent theological problems. I mean, how can an omniscient and impassible, meaning unchangeable, divine nature truly unite with a limited, passible human nature? Theologians have wrestled with that for centuries, but the three-tier model just dissolves the problem. The Son, as the eternal mediator, doesn't possess these co-equal attributes that he has to empty himself of. His divine being is eternally positioned as the perfect go-between, the intermediary between the uncaused God and creation.
Okay, now this brings us to Richard Bauckham. His divine identity thesis is probably the most powerful, most sophisticated modern defense of high Christology that uses Jewish categories. Bauckham argues that the New Testament places Jesus inside the unique identity of God by having him share in acts that only God can perform, like creating the world and receiving worship.
But the source we're looking at identifies some key vulnerabilities in Bauckham's argument. First, figures like Metatron really challenge that bright line he tries to draw between God and creation. Second, key worship texts like that one in Philippians 2 actually show veneration flowing through the exalted Son to the glory of God the Father. That's a clear pattern of agency, not identity. And finally, and this is the big one, his entire argument really rests on a false binary.
And this slide just brilliantly illustrates the core critique. Bauckham essentially gives you only two options. Jesus is either a creature or he's included within God's own unique identity. He doesn't even consider the third option that all this Jewish evidence points to, a being of supreme derivative divinity who belongs to a unique ontological tier of his own, way above creation, but still derived from the Father.
So to wrap things up, this model is not a low Christology. Not at all. In fact, you could argue it's an attempt to recover the apostles' own profoundly high Christology, one that's grounded not in metaphysical substance, but in the Son's perfect, glorious function as the agent who fully represents and reveals the invisible Father.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to chew on. By prioritizing those later Greek philosophical categories over the native Jewish framework of the apostles, could it be that the most historically grounded, the most biblically coherent understanding of Christ is actually one that Orthodox tradition, in the heat of 4th century debate, inadvertently left behind?